Hello and welcome to the Civil War podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today we're going to start our first discussion on General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who is probably one of the greatest military tacticians ever. And we're going to start off with some history. We're going to talk about the man, and then today we're going to get into the first Battle of Manassas, or the first Battle of Bull Run, as it's known. And so I hope you enjoy this podcast. So, start off with Thomas Stonewall Jackson was born in 1824 in Clarksburg, which is now in West Virginia. So back then it was in Virginia. He was a third generation. His family. So the way that a lot of farming was done back in those days was that people would go buy thousands of acres of land, plant, for example, tobacco. For a few years, it would strip the soil, and then they would pack up, buy more land, move west. And that was a common occurrence that was happening back in the early days, before we learned on how to properly, replenish fields, etc. But he was third generation, so his family had moved west to West Virginia, now West Virginia, to Virginia, Western Virginia. And they set up a farm there. Now, his father had died, youngest sister's birth, and his father died, and left mom, Julia, in desperate straits. She was single, taken up by relatives, and then the two youngest stayed with the mother, who eventually made it to her grandmother's place. And there they had a relatively good few years until, and her mom, Stonewall Jackson's mother, met another man, and then died, and then she died in childbirth of his, as well as the baby, died in childbirth. And so Stonewall Jackson was now kind of homeless because the grandma died as well during this time. Him and his sister, Nora, were taken in by his uncle, who owned a big mill and had several other uncles, and it was actually a very nice time for him there. Eventually, his sister got taken up by other relatives, and then he decided to remain after some back and forth. He decided to remain with his uncles there at Jackson's Mill. Now, he did get did win an appointment to West Point. There's some questions about this because his sister, in later years during the war, said that something was fabricated, or I don't know. Stonewall Jackson's education was not very good up to that point, basically because of where he lived and how he lived. And so when he got to West Point, he was really disadvantaged, but he worked extremely hard. In fact, a lot of his classmates would say that even though he graduated 17th out of 59 students, they said one more year he would have been top of the class. That's just how hard he strove. And yeah, quite frankly, you can kind of see, even just graduating 17 out of 59, coming in when he was probably like below the bottom rung, just shows his hard work and dedication. After this, after school, he participated in the Mexican-American War. Now, we talked about this in our previous previous podcasts, and he was there with a lot of other generals and characters who would eventually clash again in the American Civil War. But during the Mexican-American War, he was he was in charge of artillery. He was they were battling against the castle at Chapultepec, And this castle sits up on a hill, and Stonewall Jackson's artillery brigade was supposed to. They got in. They secured an area. I think it was with 2 guns, and they were under heavy fire. But they knew they had to keep firing, or otherwise they would have been overwhelmed. And he was ordered to retreat. And this is where he disobeyed that order, and he stayed where he was. And we can kind of start to see, this was maybe the first inclination of his stubbornness. Even though you can kind of see that back at West Point, just being dogged, his doggedness, not wanting to give up, not wanting to lose. We see it here. And it proved to be one of the key points, because that allowed, they eventually started to beat back the Mexican forces, and then the American army was able to come in, thanks to his success there. And, it shows for me, this kind of shows a real quality of leadership that he had back then, because he's able to keep his men in pretty difficult situation. And he basically said, look, I'm here firing. If I can do it, you guys can do it. And that is what inspired his men to stay on. He became a war hero there. And then afterwards, I think it was 1851, he became a professor at the Virginia Military Institute, the VMI. And he was a professor of basically what's now known as physics. It was kind of interesting. He was they made a lot of the students made fun of him because of his ways, and let's talk about that a little bit. First of all, he was one who basically wanted students to memorize the text. So you got a book and you were to memorize it and recite it back perfectly, and that's how you would get a good grade and pass his class. Now, memorization of text, to me, I was a former adjunct professor at Penn State University, and to me, yes, of course, there's a degree that you have to memorize, but I don't think as far as he went, where he would actually want his students to recite back the pages that they read, and he had it all memorized. And if you made a mistake, such as a red wagon instead of the red wagon, he would correct you on that. So, and just kind of thinking about memorization, like, I know that it's very important, and I've done this too, where you memorize portions of some academic knowledge, which then eventually helps you learn it, right? So memorization isn't learning. Memorization is getting it in, and then once it's in, then you actually start to learn it. Actually, why was it written this way, and why was this said, not that said? So I think it's important that I think that was a good way. I don't know if it was a good way or not, but anyway, he wasn't a very good teacher, so to say, and so he was made fun of, and he also had some very peculiar ways, the way he walked, and he was one who was extremely religious. He took his Christianity very seriously. He was a member of the Presbyterian Church. He followed all the prayers. He followed all the things like for example, no one could get him to talk about others. Now, this isn't to say that he wouldn't say negative things. It was just when it was warranted. So, for example, when he was stationed down in Florida during the Seminole Indian Wars, he got into a headbutt with his commanding officer there because he felt the commanding officer was having an affair, which went against Stonewall Jackson's Christian values. And he started a letter writing campaign about it. So when it was something that it was tangible, it wasn't gossip, that's what I'm trying to say. He was not one to be a gossip. And so he might have had some feelings, but he kept it to himself. He felt that was the Christian thing to do, not spread gossip, which is correct. So you couldn't get him to talk about others. But not to say, again, that if somebody did something wrong, he would most certainly write letters and show what was being wrong. But he also had a very peculiar diet. He had some stomach issues, some stomach problems with that followed him all his life. His eyes also had a pigmentation. They would get red. There's a particular eye disease that causes this, which would cause him to cover his eyes and prefer darkness. Interestingly, once the war started, these ailments went away. And part of it, I feel, was that when the war started, he was back in his element, right? Being a commander. But being a professor probably was not. But he stuck it out almost 10 years there at VMI. He married once first, and her name was Ellie Junkin. Junkin, Junkin. It's important, that name actually, members of her family keep coming into his life down the road. And so her father was a president of a college and also Presbyterian minister, which was great for Stonewall. She unfortunately, he loved her a lot, but she died in childbirth for their first child, which was sad. And he was just brokenhearted. Now, both of them, they started a Sunday school at the church, and this Sunday school was meant for Black people, the Black slaves, and this was something that actually was a lot of people ostracized him for doing this, because in that day and time, this was a very strong thing to do. But man, like his personality, doesn't back down. He did it. He felt it was right. That was the Christian thing to do, and he was right there. And so he started it, and it continued even after he left. And so that was a good thing. But after his wife died, he got really, really depressed. Now, she had a sister, and the sister did not like Thomas Stonewall Jackson at all. In fact, she tried to dissuade her sister from marrying him. But after her death, after Ellie's death, the sister warmed up. And in fact, the two of them started getting close, and a little too close for comfort. And back then, you did not marry your dead wife's sister. And so Jackson took a trip to Europe, and they kind of parted, got away from each other, which was good, because then those feelings died away. She ended up marrying a person who would also be involved in Stonewall Jackson's life later on. We'll talk about him later, but then he ended up finding a lady named Mary Anna Morrison, and he married her. And so it was a second wife, and then they did have some children, various things. But we won't really get into that. So let's get to November 1860. We have the election, and we had talked about last time about how the Republicans were winning, and the fears that southern states had that if the Republicans were to take control, that then Republicans would be putting people in to federal agencies that would be against the Southern, basically take away the Southern slavery institution. And so in December, after Lincoln won, South Carolina was the first to secede. Other Southern states followed, and then it was until April 12th, here in Charleston, South Carolina, when the South Carolina fired on Fort Sumter. And I'm going to have to get out on a boat and take some video of this, and I will, I promise, because I'll get out on a boat, and we'll go by the fort, and we'll take some pictures of the outside of it, video of it for you to show here. But that's what started the American Civil War, April 12th to 13th. And that's when Jackson, who was at the VMI, was brought into the Confederate Army, Virginia Army. He was a major, brought in as a major under Robert E. Lee. Go figure. So, but Jackson wasn't happy with that appointment. He said it was, what, a major? Me? Really? And he eventually, the next month, got upgraded to colonel. And he was assigned to Harpers Ferry, where he drilled and trained his men. Now, you know, the conditions of these soldiers in the camps were atrocious. I think there's a stat that, half of the men died of, diseases and dysentery and this and that just from the camp outside of battle. I mean, it's not 50%, but it's a high number. They basically lived in filth. Sanitation was non-existent, and you can just imagine what it's like. But, Jackson, who had experience in the Mexican-American War, knew what was coming. And he advocated for total war, which meant no prisoners. We go in and we just slaughter everyone and everything. Which is a little bit surprising, coming from such a deeply devout Christian man. But he was an advocate for it because he knew this was going to be long, it was going to be drawn out, and the longer it went, the less chances the South would have of winning. And he had no disillusions. He knew the reality of the situation, and so, but his recommendations went on deaf ears, but he trained his men. He trained them hard because he knew what was coming, and this training actually served its purpose very well, because when we hit to July 1861, we are going to get into the first battle of Manassas, as it's known in the South. Bull's Run in the North is what the same battle. And it was this, so a lot of the troops that went into this, both from the North and the South, were just totally unprepared for what war was going to mean. Jackson had his troops well prepared, and so that's, I think, gave him an advantage, which he leveraged during this battle, which made his name and made him famous. Let's go back and talk about it a little bit. I got a little diagram here. I'm going to read. We're going to work on this. And just kind of give a layout of the importance of Manassas and Bull's Run. So we have D.C. up here. It's about 25 miles away. And then we had the Union troops situated here in this area. Southern troops are down here by the junction, which is a railroad junction, Manassas Junction. And the reason it was so important was this. It went one, and again, this is my map, so forgive me. I'm just trying to make some big points here. There's lots and lots of details that I'm leaving out up here grossly. But the train went to the Shenandoah Valley this way, right? And actually, the General Johnston and his army were actually coming this way the day of the battle. And then Jackson's, we'll talk about this in just a couple seconds, but this is why Jackson's stand was so important. But as this junction also went down to Richmond, and so you could see how strategically important it was. General McClellan of the North, he had, I think, 35,000 troops, and he was here. But his troops, they wanted to get down here quickly. Took them forever. The men just didn't know how to march. Little basic things. They didn't know how to stay together. They didn't know how to march. That's kind of why they got routed during this battle. But it was the same on both sides. The Confederacy had the same issues, right? Just men who just were not ready for war and for battle. So McClellan was in charge of the Union, and he had 35,000 troops up here. And then the South, the Confederacy, were under Beauregard, General Beauregard, who was quite the character. We may maybe do a session on him, but he was from Louisiana, Cajun. That's where my family's from. And he spoke French, spoke Italian. He modeled himself. He thought he was the next Napoleon, the American Cajun, the Creole properly, the Creole Napoleon. Um, and he had a lot of support, but he was in charge of the Army of the Potomac, the Southern Army of the Potomac. And Jackson was part of Johnston's forces, the Shenandoah Valley forces, but he was here. Now, they had a war council the day prior, and Beauregard had his plans to do something. We're not going to get into that because I think it's more important we focus on the Union plans because it kind of shows what Jackson did. I think that's a little bit more important. We go into this battle. I mean, spend days talking about it, but Beauregard actually didn't. Jackson wasn't really part of the clique, so to say. He wasn't really considered, even though he was a brigadier general at the time. He really wasn't part of it. But anyway, they had their meeting, and so Beauregard wanted to do a flanking maneuver, but I'm going to talk about McClellan. What McClellan wanted to do was he wanted to send a group, two units this way, and then the third, right here, he wanted them to go around and hit the Confederacy from behind. That was his plan. Now, Jackson was somewhere, this is way out of scale, but Jackson was over here in his group. Now, when the battle started, we had the Union coming this way, and they were fighting the Confederate forces. One of the generals was General B, who had served in the Mexican-American War too. We're going to talk about him. And in the morning, the Union actually had the advantage. And so Jackson came and positioned himself up here on Henry Hill. And the reason why it was so strategically important for him was on the ridge, he was able to put his artillery, but when it fired, the artillery would sit back just below the ridgeline, so it was actually protected, and they could reload. Get back up, same thing with the guns, with the men. They're able to kind of go drop behind the hill under protection from the fire coming from the Union forces, really get back up. Now, B and the Confederacy were getting routed, so under extreme pressure, B is coming back this way. And he sees Jackson, and he says to Jackson, the enemy are driving us. And as he got to Jackson, the enemy are driving us. And Jackson said, well, then we are going to stand here and give them the bayonet. So as the Union was coming, Jackson said, well, we're not moving. We're going to fight to the end. And then General B said, there's Jackson standing like a stone wall. Let us stand here together with him, if this is the end. And that was the famous line. Now, there's some controversy about that. There was really nobody else who recorded this, right? So none of the other, officers heard it or said. Some said it was actually a derogatory thing that this is saying, oh, this guy's so stubborn. He's like a stone wall. He's being so stubborn standing here. I don't know. Who knows? It's lost in history. I'll go with the more positive one. And so then B turned, and at this time, so B turned here, and then it's just boom, 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 firing on the Union. And the reason this was so important was because General Johnston's men were coming on the trains from the Shenandoah Valley, and they were able to get to Manassas Junction, and then they were able to come in. So General Johnston's men, were able then to come in and support. When this happened, Union broke ranks and started to full-scale retreat, running back to D.C. And and this is where Jackson said to his men during this battle, stand your ground, and then charge. And when you charge, scream like furies. Now, what's a fury? A fury is an old Greek. That's like a demon type of thing, that an avenging ghost, right? If somebody was murdered or something wrong, these were avenging ghosts of furies. And yell like furies. And that's where the famous rebel yell came from. And so the Confederacy Army then started to charge, and Union broke ranks, started to flee, and it was a huge rout, and McClellan lost. And this, I think, had a lot of impact for him going down the line. We're going to talk about McClellan later in another podcast. But this is where Jackson's famous stand got him this reputation of Stonewall Jackson, and then she became super famous from that point on. He was then granted a major general position, which deserved. And we're going to go ahead and stop there. By the way, the Union, when they were fleeing, we had at the time, there were people coming in from D.C., congressmen, all types of fancy people came down to actually watch the battle. They thought the Union was just going to walk all over the Confederates, and as they're all running, everybody's picking up their big picnic baskets and blankets and running too. So, So for me, I will make a comment. I think that this, for General McClellan up in the North, this is a huge lesson learned. He's been criticized because he then parked his army, and he wouldn't move. He just trained and recruited and trained, and he got criticized. But this battle, to me, really pointed out to him, we're not ready, and that and he wasn't going to engage again like this. He wasn't going to lose again. So that's, I think, part of the reason why he did what he did. In another podcast, we will talk about his army and his strategy. But for now, we're still on General Stonewall Jackson. So he had this huge win. He did lose his finger. A bullet came through, hit him in the hand. He had his hand up. He had his hand up in the air. Went right through it. Declined medical attention. Because he was going to stand there and win, and he really showed some great resiliency and great tactical taking advantage of that hill like he did. So that concludes this episode of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. We will come back with next one. We'll continue on General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. We're going to look at his campaigns in the Shenandoah Valley and take it from there. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you all again soon. Cheers.